Yesterday I watched it on YouTube. Now I know it's a fact.
G'day everybody, I've produced this one a slightly different way. Hopefully all the levels and everything are okay. This microphone and Audacity tend to be a little bit sensitive, so my audio sounds a bit scratchy to me, but we'll see how it goes, won't we? Hopefully this video will play very nicely. I spent a lot of time producing it. This is actually my fourth attempt at getting this out. This is the Q&A show on the ABC, for those of you not in the know. It's a panel talk show on the Australian national taxpayer funded broadcaster. This panel show, well, the station is meant to show no political bias, but this show was the perfect expression of the ABC's regular bias. I will disappear shortly and play the pre-recorded video for you. There will be a little bit of commentary at the end due to having found out some more information since recording. Hopefully this will be fine. Let's see how it goes. I haven't exactly been nice to people in this, but I don't think nice was warranted.
Hello and welcome to Q&A. I'm Frank Kelly, and tonight we're in Melbourne collaborating with the Wheeler Centre's Broadside Festival. On our panel, anti-ageism author Ashton Applewhite.
As an older person, what in the fuck is ageism, and how in the fuck do you become an ageism writer?
Egyptian-American feminist Mona El-Tahawi.
And as if the hair wasn't enough of a giveaway, clown number one for the exhibit.
Businesswoman and social change agent Hannah Asafiri.
And while not so brightly coloured, and obviously not in whiteface, clown number two for the exhibit.
Indigenous screenwriter and activist Nayuka Gorry.
And a big hand everyone for Miss Movember for helping out. What's that here you say? Don't pick on the lady for her facial hair. Show some respect. No, sorry, nobody on this panel deserves any respect for this show.
And Jess Hill, whose latest work is challenging old assumptions about male violence.
I'm sure this one's an exciting work. As a rabid feminist, she must have the best insight into the male psyche.
Please welcome our panel.
Nope, this panel can just go and get fucked.
And our first question tonight comes from Nisha Kott.
The interim report of the Royal Commission into Aged Care has damned Australia's system as inhumane, abusive and unjustified. Yet there seems to be very little attention paid to these findings. Do we as a nation care more about parties, hats and frocks than we do about our elderly?
Thank you very much. And I think that was a reference to what's going on at the moment with the Melbourne Cup tomorrow.
She thinks just maybe it'll have something to do with the biggest horse race in the calendar. Yeah. Just maybe. Now, what about the false dichotomy? Why can't we look after our old people and have the horse race? Why do we need the dichotomy in the question?
So let's bring in an Australian on this one. Hannah, what do you think? Do we care more about parties and frocks at the Melbourne Cup than we do about our older Australians?
Well, I think, the findings are horrific, and they weren't any surprise given when they first came to light with the ABC report, and they are horrific, but I think they are symptomatic of our attitudes towards minorities.
So we start the answer by dismissing the elderly people and just making this about minorities. That's not what the report was about, it's not what the question was about. This was about elderly people in care not getting great treatment.
So it's not just attitudes towards the elderly. I think as a country we have positioned minorities in competition with a whole host of other issues.
Okay, so you've tossed this out and we're just meant to lap this up, aren't we? We've put minorities in competition with a number of issues. Do you mind naming one of these issues? One that's constant for all minorities while you throw old people under the bus.
So I think aged care and the abuses of aged care have become a consequence of how we view minorities, how at best we are indifferent to them, and at worst we are hostile to minorities.
Right, later in this show there'll be a statistic that explains why we are at worst indifferent to elderly people in care. But you've made this about minorities, so you can insist that we hate them all. Go fuck yourself. At our worst, we are indifferent to the aged care issue.
All minorities, including women, disabled groups, queer community, Muslims.
So let's see. Your first minority is women. Well done, you. What are you, 50 to 51% of the population? Fucking great work there. But you then made women synonymous with disability, old age, and for some fucking reason being Muslim. Where the fuck did you dig that out of your ass?
And for me, this is part of that conversation that we need to have, although specifically we need to look at what's happening in aged.
Oh, specifically we need to look at aged care, do we? Even though you fucking threw them under the bus for the last bloody 2 minutes. But I'd like to know if this is a discussion we actually need to have or not, because I don't think it is. And if we do, can we have it with intelligent people who can fuck right off out of it?
Okay.
Yeah, Ashton, ageism is a big part of your work, really, and your thought. Do you think it is separate to the other isms in a way?
Well, it's paradoxical in that aging, is the one universal human experience. And older people, are a minority of the population. Ageism, I should say, is any judgment on the basis of age. So young people, children, experience a lot of it too. A society that doesn't look after children is also ageist.
I was a little concerned that the term ageism had no fucking meaning. But let's see. Everyone ages. Young people and old people can be ageismed against. Doesn't that mean anyone who just aged an entire minute in the last minute and survived it can be ageismed against?
I think that we have... that it is indeed, I think Hannah's right, that it does represent how we treat people at the margins of society. I would say capitalism is probably the biggest driver in that we don't respect people who don't contribute in conventional economic terms, which means children and retired people, even though they contribute in many ways that are harder to measure and often enable other people to contribute in conventional ways.
Okay.
Will you stop projecting your own economic ignorance on us, please? This is not about capitalism first. This is about a for-profit industry. But I think people understand that elderly people contributed to the wealth of the nation and that young people are a multi-billion-dollar industry.
What about, let's stick with the Australians for a minute, because the reference was a reference to the Melbourne Cup. But we've also had this Royal Commission into aged care just handed down last week. And one of the findings from the Royal Commissioners was that the shocking state of our aged care sector, and it was described as sad and shocking, and cruel and harmful, was it represented an ageist mindset. Jess, do you think we've got an ageist mindset in our society?
For the record, I have absolutely no fucking respect for a government finding that found ageism was a problem. Fucking hell.
Yeah, and I think some of it is just that a lot of us are terrified of getting old, right? And so there's probably a bit of a sense when our own relatives get old, some of us are upstanding children and we remain in their lives and we look after them, and others run for the hills.
Let's face it, this is the post-feminist world you created. Mummy and Daddy both go to work now. Jilly and Jimmy go to school and daycare. And Grandma's got no one left at home to look after her. Well done you. Plus some grandmas aren't nice enough for their kids to think they're worth looking after. And some old people didn't even have kids.
And I think sometimes we don't want to look because a lot of us feel complicit that we didn't look after our grandparents. Or I know personally I feel guilt about not necessarily being there for my own nonna when she started to go senile. It was something that I just couldn't accept.
I mentioned that later on there'll be a statistic that says how many of us do this. And it's fuck all, so we're not complicit. You are projecting your own failures on the rest of us, thank you.
And I probably needed to turn a blind eye to it.
If there was adequate state support, you wouldn't feel you had to go it alone.
That's also true. And obviously,
Look at this smug bitch. She thinks she's a genius. No, idiot. It is not up to the government to fund the profits of private institutions. The complacency is on the part of the person you're talking to, and she is now agreeing with you that maybe the government could pay for her to be more complicit.
I guess that when we feel complicit in perhaps our own negligence, and you see this with the lack of men in the violence against women sector.
And the feminist war cry goes up. We can't do it on our own, we need more men. How are you going to address violence against men and children at the hands of women?
Sometimes that means that we want to look away. And, when we think about things like animals, how many of us have buried a racehorse?
Probably more than you know, sweetie. I used to have a couple of old racehorses I used for fence work. Saved them from the knackers, essentially, but where do you think all the old pony club ponies go? Stop the little girls riding?
Not many, We don't feel complicit in that. We can point a finger quite purely and say what a disgusting practice that is, and we don't want to be any part of it. But this disgusting practice of putting our old people in aged care homes and leaving them there to literally rot in some cases is something that a lot of us are complicit in.
Yeah, and there is a shocking statistic that came out in that aged care commission inquiry, which is that 40% of people within our aged care system don't get any visitors.
Yes, we went over this. This is a post-feminist world, remember? Mummy and Daddy are busy. Jilly and Jimmy are busy. Nobody's got time for Grandma.
Like, how does that strike you and the way we treat older people in our community? And as you compare that to people with, Indigenous services?
Yeah, well, I think, if I'm really honest, in Australia anyway, I think we're saying Australians, but I think if we're looking at who we're actually talking about, I don't really see that in my community. I think that we value older people in a very different way, and elders have a higher standing in our community.
Do you mean the outback communities where the elders complain about getting beaten up by the young people? Or my mate Jimmy, who got denied his elder status by the women who these days run the tribes because he has a different political viewpoint to them on ideas like welfare dependence.
And while I'm talking, I should also acknowledge the country that we're all on and the country that we're all listening and watching on. I think we treat older people in a more respectful way. I think, what we're seeing is also white culture.
Yes, the whitest blackfella on the planet is about to tell us how her European heritage is going to destroy everything. Is that a Greek moustache? It is quite impressive.
Yeah, I think different cultures have different ways.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that too often the white experience, the white male experience generally, but the white experience overall is taken as the default. And I think that the rest of us, those of us who are not white, those of us who are not able-bodied, those of us who are not men, those of us who are not those defaults end up having to explain that this is not our experience. And I think, when I look at my family in Egypt...
As a default human being, I'm a little bit concerned that you think being female is a disability. But I also have a problem with you comparing our Western nations with the Arab ones. We're not the ones throwing LBGT people off buildings.
When I look at, it's very similar to what you're saying, that it's very rare. Although it's some families, because they're split by migration and work abroad and stuff, it's still very rare. But I think it's really important for white people to acknowledge this as their problem and to begin learning from us.
I fast-forwarded a chunk of that because you were just being a racist, bigoted, sexist piece of shit anyway for this entire reply. So I'm just concerned that might be what you want us to learn from you. Do you have another trick? Because you seem to be a one-trick pony.
It's also we do also have a culture of just locking things away that we don't want to look at. So we do it with homelessness, we do it with people who are incarcerated, people with disabilities. If it's too inconvenient, we'll just shut people away.
Do we, or are you projecting? Do we have these institutions maybe because we care and we try to find solutions?
I think this is one of the things that's exactly what pushes down. Okay, our next question is from Catherine Bennett. I'm a 62-year-old woman who works full-time and I'm very fortunate to have a fabulous job. The covert ageism I experienced during some interviews before securing my current role was stressful, just to say the least. One person conducted a phone interview with me and had almost guaranteed me the job until I saw that he'd looked up my LinkedIn profile photo and I never heard from him again. How do we convince employers that people who are older are great workers with so much to contribute?
Ashton, I think we filed that one straight to you.
On the aged care point, I just want to point out that only 5% of the population is in aged care homes. Our fears are out of proportion.
I mentioned this statistic was coming up a couple of times earlier. 5% of people are in aged care. It doesn't negate the fact that we have problems that need to be dealt with. but it means that we are addressing a fairly small issue. What's important about this is it negates the idea that our society is fucking ageist.
This issue of discrimination in the workforce is widespread. The evidence is everywhere. The single stereotype about older workers is true. Less creative, less dependable, none of that is true. So of course, what we want is for employers to judge employees not by what they look like, no matter what role they serve, for no matter where they come from, on the basis of their individual capacity. The age discrimination is illegal. It's important for people to call it out because it's easier for you to get your foot in the door, which is why I do, which is to help develop a grassroots social movement like women's movement, which change the way we live in the world. Not enough studies started to do it. We need to do that around position older people in society because addressing ageism at its broadest level between 3 years and then how it plays out in the workforce, in our healthcare systems everywhere. That is where it has to begin. So people can look at that workers for the capacity, individual capacity to do a good job. It's really very difficult. Shifting nuts and government decided at the time do everything they can get people employed in that. It doesn't seem to shift.
Hannah, you employ people. Do you employ older people?
I absolutely do. And I think it's also important to look at the gendered nature of aged care. And when it comes to women and women who have had their careers interrupted and then find themselves needing to re-enter the workforce.
I think what she's saying here is that although they are a victim minority of 50% of the population, women have the luxury of living longer and so they dominate the populations in aged care centres. What she's also saying here is men like myself have never had our careers ripped out from underneath us and had to find other paths in life. I never had my electrical licences removed by legislative changes that made my trade obsolete. No, that just never happened, did it? This looks like another one of those creative ways to make it a women's issue to me.
So I'm somebody who speaks to responding to circuit breaking the cycle of disadvantage for women, whether they be escaping situations of violence or whether they be experiencing societal discrimination and or finding themselves in their third age needing to come back into the workforce. And coincidentally, the highest group of homelessness in this country are women over 50.
Bull fucking shit! Characteristics of the homeless population. It didn't take me more than 5 seconds to find this in a search. A few interesting characteristics of the total homeless population in Australia. Males made up 58% of the homeless and females 42%. Males outnumbered females in every category, but particularly rough sleepers 66% and boarding house residents 73%. It was close to even 51 to 49% in supported accommodation for the homeless. This difference between them was mainly among the older population. Despite the elderly population in general being skewed towards females, the older homeless population was very male dominated, with 59% male in the 75 plus age range and 65% in the 65 to 74 age range. Amongst young people under 18, homelessness was about 50-50, male-female. The highest rate of homelessness was in the 19 to 24 age range, 95 per 10,000 people. But 16% were aged over 55. Torres Strait, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people made up 20% of the homeless population Australia-wide, 3% of the total population. All categories of homelessness increased from 2011 to 2016, except for people in supported accommodation for the homelessness, for the homeless, which was largely flat. Now, this would have to have skewed quite hard for this woman's claim to be true. So it's possible women are being more highly represented in this area, but I doubt that they are the majority.
So yes, I employ them as a matter of course, but I think what we need to do is look at why that is and why women's work is not recognised, and how do we train women up so that they do and can be re-engaged inside work.
Words currently on the screen are not just for the women out there, it's how I raise my sons. If you really want equality, get your ass into gear.
Our next question, it's a video from Belinda Day from Echuca in Victoria.
Our mum, Tanya Day, died in custody because Victoria Police targeted her for being drunk in public. They then failed to properly care for her after they locked her up in a police cell. In all Australian legal history, no police officer has ever been held criminally responsible for an Aboriginal person's death in custody, despite hundreds of Aboriginal people dying in their care. As Aboriginal people, we know that racism was the cause of our mum's death and is the cause of so much pain and harm in this country. How do we get institutions to acknowledge racism, and how should people be held to account?
Do you know what happens when you lie when you make a statement? I don't fucking believe a single word you say after that. Your mother was not targeted by the police. She was also arrested for being drunk and disorderly, not just drunk, even though that was what was used, and it was probably used because it allowed the police to release her when she sobered up. But the police also tried to contact family to let them know to come and get her, but you weren't available to be contacted. Now, you left all of this out when you made your statement that this was racism and the police were to blame for your mother being pissed at a very early hour of the day, getting on a train, laying across 2 seats, putting her feet out in the aisle and not being able to produce a ticket for the conductor when he came and asked her to move her legs and produce said ticket. She also became unruly, which is when he called the police. They did not target her. This blatant lie makes me think your whole fucking story is a load of fucking shit, and your pretense at grief is just as much fucking shit. Do not ask me for sympathy at this point. Now I've explained why you're not getting a sympathetic hearing, because I believe you to be a liar. Where were you and where was your responsibility to your mother? Where was your mother's responsibility to not be pissed and disorderly on a public train? Now, the events of the period are explained very well in reports. The police were asked to come and take care of your mother, who was being unruly, and they apparently did their best for her. Now, the constable or the officer who was asked to look after your mother was asked to check on her in person every half hour. He chose to instead check on her every 40 minutes through the door, and he reckons he got verbal responses from her, and he watched her on the CCTV every 20 minutes. Now, this seems a reasonably fair compromise to any reasonable person, but apparently your mother fell and hit her head at some point, adding to her being pissed and fucking not particularly great state. Now, an ambulance was called as soon as they realised your mother had problems, and it took a fucking shitload of time to get to the station, and it took another half hour to get to the hospital. There is absolutely no fucking way, unless you're going to blame the ambulance next for taking so long to get there, for also being racist. Because that's what you want the message to be. You want the message to be you're fucking racist. Now pay us monies. We want compensation. That's what this is about. That's why you started out with a fucking bold-faced fucking lie. Now, I normally wouldn't walk over someone's grief, but you don't appear to have any, because you're not showing any respect over this entire fucking matter by opening with a blatant fucking lie that the police targeted your mother because they're fucking racists. Go fuck yourself. I've had my fucking fill of hearing about false accusers. Welcome the fuck to the post-Me Too world that feminism created.
No, Yuko, it's a big and it's a key question, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. It's really difficult, I think, when we're talking about institutions like police. I think it's really tempting to think about how can we make the police nicer? Should we hire more black people? Should we have more women?
The rather crude assumption being that black people are better than the rest of us because of their skin tone, and women are better than us because vag.
But what we need to remember is that the police started, like its very formation was to serve the interests of white sovereignty in this country. So I don't know if we're talking about accountability, I don't know how far we can go in keeping an organisation like the police to account, because it is there to be violent, it is patriarchal, and it is overwhelmingly white. So how do we... I think it shouldn't exist.
You're a fucking idiot. Would you like us to have public custodians, maybe? Vigilantes that get together in a nice group. They have a forensic lab, and they have a little block of cells down there for locking away the people you don't like. And you get to decide who's in these public vigilantes, the public custodians. Because the world would be a much better place if you get to decide, won't it? I mean, the first thing that's going to be allowed is blackfellas are going to be allowed to lounge all over our trains and tell people to fuck off. How could anyone believe that's going to be a terrible place to live?
But I think,
But how do we do it? Let's talk about that, because we're nearly 30 years since we had a Royal Commission to black deaths in custody.
Yeah.
One of the key things they found was that public drunkenness should no longer be a criminal offence, and it hasn't changed. So if Royal Commissions aren't doing it, so how do we make this change? And are things changing? Because this is the first inquest, this one into Tanya Day's death, to formally consider systemic racism as a contributing factor. Is that a sign of improvement?
Firstly, they tried to contact this woman's family so that they didn't have to put her in a cell. But in order to put her in a cell, they have to have a reason. Now, public drunkenness makes a fairly easy reason to let her out when she's sobered up. So, it makes sense that for her own protection and to keep her out of everyone else's way, because she was being disruptive, and drunk and disorderly is normally the charge applied to people. So she was lucky she didn't have that applied. I think if this systemic racism, as you are trying to infer, was examined by the Commission, then it was that the police feared just throwing her in a cell as they would have a disruptive white fella.
So how incremental? Like what? I'm wary of talking about Auntie Tanya Day's family. I think they ultimately decide what justice is for their mum. They decide, like in all of these discussions, we should be centering the family and what they want. But as an observer in the community and being on the outside, but also being a black fella, I think having police investigate themselves is not a way. I can't see how accountability can come from that. And that still happens, and that's always happened. So
okay, in that spiel, these idiots seem to think that the police don't have to provide digital evidence and recorded evidence to royal commissions and inquests. But she also seems to think that justice should be left up to the families, not up to the law. And I'm not sure where she gets these stupid ideas, but she's a fucking clown. But then, she doesn't want police either, so I guess that's quite reasonable.
Mona, how do we get institutions to, acknowledge racism and do something about it? How do we hold people to account?
Well, you're asking the person here who travels the world to say, fuck the patriarchy.
Which translates as another cult's version of Satan, and they're out to get the mythical beast.
So I think that what we have to do is start seriously talking about patriarchy. I'm not talking about white supremacist capitalist imperialist patriarchy, to quote black American feminist because what I'm hearing here is very similar to what's happening in the United States. But also I do want to connect it to what so often in the news is portrayed as a problem in the country of Egypt, where police brutality is connected to fascist state or a military state. And so very easy for people to say, well, the police were Egypt is a dictatorship. And you rarely make that connection between the dictatorship between Australia, where ostensibly a democracy. What we're talking about is the overwhelming power of the state, and that state is driven by the white supremacist.
I can't make you listen to this shit. Even the audience look dumbfounded. Look at this. Basically, it's white man bad by the whitest Egyptian who ever lived. Capitalism, patriarchy, all the usual suspects are all blamed, and no fucking sense is made at all. So if you don't mind, I shall continue to skip this. I will put the original video up somewhere and link to it if you've got brain cells to spare.
All of these men are patriarchal authoritarians at the heart of the way that they rule is violence. And that violence ends. The violence is meted out to you depending on where in the hierarchy you belong. And so if you're a woman, if you're queer, if you're femme, if you're disabled, etc. So for me, I think patriarchy is like an octopus. The head of the octopus is misogyny. But the eight tentacles are these things we're talking about. So it would be capitalism, it would be brutality, it would be homophobia. All of these systems of oppression that privilege male dominance. We're talking about a very specific male kind of violence, and again, according to the tentacles of the patriarchy. So for me, we have to have this discussion. We have to decide what patriarchy is. That's how I do. It has to be a reality. But it's in 2019, for those of you that and we're still talking about people who need to have unleashed unconscionable. I think also, if I can just jump in, I think, like, yes, let's talk about patriarchy, but we're talking about self-colonialism like Australia. We need to question where that patriarchy comes from. Colonialism is yeah, well, particularly also, like, it's not just racism, white supremacy, it's also wanting to disappear indigenous people and, mass origin upheld. I think the danger, and I think Queensland is a really good example, where we kind of zone in on one particular place, like Australia, up in Queensland. We have this kind of culture of being able to, want to hit on one person and just say, one bad guy or a couple of bad apples. Like, if we're thinking about places, thinking about institutions, we have to understand that this cultural issue is a systemic issue. And beyond the places, it's not just places, we also have, say, institutions like healthcare system. I'm thinking of Mary Williams up in New South Wales, where she died of something that should have been preventable. She had doctors 18 times, and like, racism absolutely played a role in that.
Okay, I'm going to let the host sum this up for all the other horrendous bitches on the panel. And I only say that because it's true, they are horrendous bitches. But I think she sums up the whole thing very nicely.
And entrenched racism is, unquestionable.
That's it. It's unquestionable. It's about patriarchy and colonisation and white people and white culture and mainly white males and patriarchy and colonisation and trying to hide the black fellas and all of that shit, and it's all unfucking questionable. Don't you dare fucking question it. I think that pretty much sums up all of that last bit of the show, and I'm going to call it quits on this one for now. I'm going to call a second part to this. We'll see how we go getting through the whole fucking thing, eh? Okay, we seem to have gotten there. That didn't go too bad at all. I was going to bring up some more stuff on the day case because that really fucking shit me, and I really had trouble walking over someone else's grief or pretense of grief, I'm going to say, as I did. It's a hard thing to do, but the open lie, the obvious lie, makes me have very little respect for the person in question. But the day woman died in hospital 17 days after falling out of the cell cot and hitting her forehead on the ground. Now, a few people in Australia, around the world, but in Australia that happens too, people die falling out of beds. This is a thing that happens. But to expect the police to be able to recognise a brain bleed, which is what she died of, while she's in a cell, drunk, just from having fallen out of a bed. I mean, who knows? Maybe the brain bleed was something that was going on earlier. Maybe it wasn't just the falling out of bed. But in any case, to expect the police to be able to recognise a brain bleed out of somebody who apparently picked herself up off the floor after falling and becoming unresponsive sometime later is just fucking insane. As soon as they knew she was unresponsive, they called an ambulance, she was taken to a hospital, and she died 17 days later. So she didn't actually die in police custody at all. She died in the care of a hospital who couldn't address her wound because it was her brain bleeding. Now, I don't know what the police were supposed to do about that. Had they been right there the minute she fell out of the bed, there is a fair chance they may not have been able to do anything about a brain bleed. She may still have died. They're not the ones who pushed her out of the bed. She fell. She was pissed. Anyway, I wanted to add that because I found that in a story a little bit after I did the recording. I'm going to call this one a day. I'm going to call it quits. I've been the anti-theocrat. Come back for part 2 if you've got the brain cells to spare. And may your gods remain fictional. I'll see you in the next one.